June 16, 1944, Saipan, Northern Mariana Islands. The invasion beach still smolders. The ocean glows faintly red beneath a sky filled with drifting smoke. Spent cartridges, broken helmets, and fragments of coral lie scattered across the tide line. Among them, a new sound begins to rise, deeper, heavier, more deliberate than gunfire. Bulldozers. Dozens of them. Coated in salt spray and dust, the machines grind forward through the sand, steel treads clanking like armor. Their operators, men of the U.S. Navy's construction battalions, the Seabees, sit behind open controls with sleeves rolled high, faces streaked with oil and sun. A few Marines glance over as the dozers advance, engines roaring past craters still hot from bombardment. While Japanese shells whistle overhead, the Seabees begin to work. They level beach obstacles, clear wreckage, and carve pathways inland, creating, in hours, the kind of access roads that most armies would need weeks to build. By sunset, a rough highway runs from the waterline toward the ridges. Trucks begin to move. Tanks follow. Supplies flow. On the hills beyond, Japanese observers stare in disbelief. They had expected chaos and confusion. Instead, they see an army that builds while it fights. A nation that turns raw jungle into the architecture of victory. By the middle of 1942, the Pacific Ocean had become a battlefield of vast distances and brutal conditions. Each island, no matter how small, held strategic value, a stepping stone toward Japan or a shield against invasion. Yet, between these islands lay a natural defense stronger than any army: distance, jungle, and terrain. The Pacific was not Europe. There were no railways, no paved roads, no bridges waiting to be seized. Every landing force that came ashore faced a wilderness untouched by modern hands. Coral ridges, volcanic ash, tangled mangroves, and heat so thick it made breathing an effort. On these islands, even victory could turn to paralysis if supplies, tanks, and heavy guns couldn't move. The early American campaigns exposed that weakness. At Guadalcanal in August 1942, Marines fought for months over an airfield whose construction had barely begun. The Japanese had started it. The Americans finished it under constant fire. Supplies had to be carried by hand through the mud. Roads washed out with every rain. It became clear that defeating Japan would require more than courage and firepower. It would require engineers who could turn chaos into order. Fast. That realization gave birth to one of the most remarkable organizations of the war, the U.S. Navy Construction Battalions, the Seabees. Authorized in early 1942 under Admiral Ben Moriel, they were not typical sailors. Many were skilled tradesmen: miners, welders, mechanics, surveyors, carpenters, men who had built America's cities and factories. Now, they would build under fire. Their motto was simple and direct: we build, we fight. From the moment of their creation, the Seabees embodied the industrial power that defined the United States in World War II. Each battalion carried bulldozers, graders, cranes, and power shovels, machines that symbolized an empire of production. They could land on a beach in the morning, clear it by noon, and have a functioning base before sunset. Unlike civilian contractors or peacetime engineers, these men were trained to fight. They carried rifles beside their tools. When Japanese snipers harassed them, they built walls from bulldozers or used heavy equipment as moving shields. To the Marines who fought beside them, the Seabees became both builders and brothers in arms. But their real weapon wasn't the rifle. It was speed. In the Pacific, the measure of survival wasn't just how fast a soldier could shoot, but how fast an army could build. Every hour without a road meant tanks stranded in the sand. Every delay in a supply line meant rations spoiling offshore. The Seabees' job was to make sure the U.S. war machine could move, no matter where it landed. Their early operations tested both courage and ingenuity. On Guadalcanal, Bougainville, and Tarawa, they carved airstrips out of coral, built docks from shattered wreckage, and repaired runways under fire. Sometimes they worked in water up to their waists, with Japanese artillery zeroing in on their positions. But even in those brutal beginnings, a pattern emerged. Wherever the Seabees landed, the American advance accelerated. Commanders began to plan invasions around their capabilities. If the Seabees could guarantee a usable airfield or road in days, the entire logistics of war could shift forward. By 1943, the Navy realized something profound. These men were not just support troops. They were a strategic weapon, and their bulldozers, graders, and cranes were as vital as the guns of the fleet. Their next challenges would prove that idea beyond doubt, on islands where speed meant survival, and the jungle itself became the enemy. By 1943, the U.S. had begun to master the art of amphibious warfare, but the Pacific remained a brutal teacher. Each new landing brought a fresh lesson in geography and endurance. The maps might show islands, but in reality, these were mountains rising from the sea, wrapped in jungle and encircled by reefs. Ships could barely anchor close enough to unload supplies. Men waded through surf under fire, carrying crates of ammunition and fuel cans over their heads. Vehicles bogged down in sand before reaching the tree line. Every invasion demanded roads, airfields, fuel depots, and hospitals, all before the enemy regrouped. And the Seabees were the ones who made it happen. Their mission began almost the moment the first wave of Marines hit the beach. As soon as the beachhead was secure, sometimes even before, Seabees would come ashore with bulldozers, graders, and trucks lashed to landing craft. They built ramps from logs, leveled coral reefs to make runways, and turned raw jungle into supply bases. In some cases, they worked within range of Japanese artillery, guided by engineers who had learned to read terrain like generals read maps. The U.S. strategy of island hopping, Tinian, devised under Admiral Chester W. Nimitz and General Douglas MacArthur, depended on such speed. Instead of retaking every enemy position, American forces would leapfrog from one island to another, capturing only those essential for airfields and fleet bases. Each new stronghold became a launch point for bombers, submarines, and invasion fleets moving closer to Japan. But this strategy only worked if those islands could be transformed fast enough to sustain war. That transformation was the Seabees' domain. At Tarawa, November 1943, they rebuilt a damaged pier under constant fire to allow supplies to land, an act that saved thousands of Marines trapped without ammunition. At Bougainville, they built airstrips through jungle mud so thick that even tracked vehicles sank. On Kwajalein, they completed roads and fuel depots in record time, sometimes working 20-hour shifts surrounded by wreckage and the stench of war. Still, the greatest challenge lay ahead. In the Mariana Islands, a group of islands whose capture would put Japan itself within range of U.S. bombers. The campaign would begin at Saipan, a heavily fortified island 1,300 miles from Tokyo. The battle plan called for Marines to land on the western beaches while the Seabees followed close behind. Their orders were simple: once ashore, build. Roads for armor, runways for aircraft, supply lines for everything from tanks to field kitchens. Without these, even victory would collapse under its own weight. But Saipan was no ordinary island. Its coastline was lined with coral cliffs, and its interior was a tangle of ridges, caves, and thick vegetation. The Japanese had spent years preparing its defenses, expecting a prolonged siege. To them, the idea that Americans could build anything usable in such terrain, under bombardment, in days, seemed impossible. When the invasion began on June 15, 1944, the Seabees came ashore almost immediately after the first Marine assault waves. Bulldozers were offloaded from landing ship tanks, rolling down ramps as artillery still thundered overhead. Within hours, they were clearing paths through sand and wreckage. By nightfall, roads began to form where none had existed that morning. The next day, those roads would allow Sherman tanks to move inland, supplies to flow forward, and the wounded to be evacuated back to the beach. It was an act of engineering speed that shocked both sides, a moment when construction became as decisive as combat itself. In that jungle heat, beneath the smoke and dust, the Pacific War began to change shape. The Americans were no longer just fighting for ground. They were building the infrastructure of victory, one bulldozer blade at a time. The U.S. Navy Seabees were unlike any other engineering force of the war. They didn't wait for battles to end. They built in the middle of them. Their bulldozers and graders advanced almost alongside infantry, sometimes clearing minefields before the shooting had even stopped. What made this possible wasn't just courage. It was a level of industrial efficiency and logistical design that no other nation could match. Every Seabee unit moved with its own floating factory. Their ships carried prefabricated steel runways, pier sections, repair depots, and fuel tanks. When the Marines seized a beachhead, the Seabees didn't improvise. They executed. Within hours, cranes swung ashore and tractors rolled down temporary pontoon causeways. What looked like chaos to the enemy was, in truth, a carefully rehearsed rhythm of construction, one that transformed geography itself into a weapon. Japanese defenders couldn't comprehend how such massive machines could be transported, unloaded, and operating so quickly. On Saipan, they saw roads appear overnight across what had been dense mangrove and volcanic rock. On Peleliu, the Seabees bulldozed coral ridges flat enough for tanks to advance in less than 2 days. And on Tinian, American engineers extended runways long enough for B-29 bombers to launch within weeks of the island's capture. Behind these feats lay a quiet revolution in logistics. American industrial power had turned engineering into combat. Every dozer, truck, and roller was part of a global supply chain that began in Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Seattle. While Japan struggled to move equipment between islands, the U.S. Navy's service force maintained a seamless flow of machinery, fuel, and spare parts across thousands of miles of ocean. Ships functioned as mobile depots. Bulldozers came ashore fully fueled and battle-ready. Even the machines themselves were tactical instruments. The Caterpillar D7 and D8 bulldozers, modified for amphibious operations, were fitted with armor plates and waterproofed exhausts. They could wade through surf, climb embankments, and push aside wreckage that blocked landing craft. Some were converted into tank dozers, fitted with Sherman tank chassis for protection against small arms fire. Every move of these machines reshaped the battlefield. Where Japanese defenses relied on terrain, steep ridges, jungles, swamps, the Seabees erased those advantages. A swamp became a road, a ridge became a ramp, and an airstrip appeared where there had been forest hours earlier. The jungle, once Japan's shield, became America's raw material. And with every mile of road carved and every strip of coral flattened, a message echoed across the Pacific. Industrial engineering had become a new form of warfare. Battles were no longer won only by soldiers and guns, but by the power to build faster than the enemy could destroy. By 1944, even Japanese officers began to note it in their field diaries that the Americans didn't just invade islands, they reconstructed them. The bulldozer had become as decisive a weapon as the rifle. The war felt different from the front lines of glory that history often remembers. There were no medals for carving coral or hauling gravel under fire, but every road they built was a lifeline. The Seabees were construction workers, mechanics, and miners, men who had built America before they built its empire in the Pacific. Many had never held a rifle before the war, yet they landed on beaches where the air itself seemed to burn. A bulldozer driver might begin his day clearing wreckage while Japanese snipers watched from the tree line. Sometimes they fired. The Seabee didn't stop. He ducked once, maybe twice, then pushed the throttle forward and kept grading the earth. The Marines called them the men who fought with shovels. Their courage came not from aggression, but from duty, the belief that every foot of cleared ground meant more supplies, more medics, more food for the men fighting ahead. They worked without rest. On Saipan, bulldozers ran 20 hours a day under floodlights rigged from broken jeeps. On Tinian, Seabees built a 7,000-foot runway in just over 2 weeks, sleeping in the cabs of their machines between shifts. The heat was suffocating, the coral dust cut into their lungs, and malaria hovered in the stagnant pools beside their camps. But they didn't slow down. Orders were simple. Get it done. And somehow, they did. To Japanese soldiers, the sight was almost surreal. Diaries recovered after the battles spoke of machines that do not sleep and men who build cities overnight. One captured engineer wrote of his disbelief that Americans could construct a new world upon the ruins of the old before his own troops could regroup. It wasn't just speed, it was mentality. Japanese doctrine saw warfare as spiritual endurance, sacrifice for the emperor. The American approach was mechanical, a fight of output, innovation, and logistics. The Seabees embodied that difference, where one side sought to endure destruction, the other sought to rebuild through it. And this rebuilding changed morale on both sides. For the U.S. troops, the sight of Seabees turning a blasted island into a functional base gave an instant sense of permanence. It said, "We're not leaving." Marines who fought on Tarawa and Saipan later recalled that moment, when the bulldozers arrived, as the point when they knew the island was truly theirs. But for the Japanese, it meant despair. Every time they destroyed a pier, a new one appeared. Every crater they created was filled. Every jungle barrier they relied on became an American highway. It was a psychological defeat deeper than gunfire. The realization that they were fighting a nation that could not only replace what was lost, but improve it under fire. Sita Tu-Fei, U.S. war correspondent on Guam, wrote that the Seabees did not just move Earth, they moved time. In hours, they advanced the war's calendar. In days, they gave commanders what normally took months to achieve. Their machines rumbled like thunder through the Pacific night, and for every Japanese outpost listening beyond the tree line, that sound was more terrifying than the roar of bombers, because it meant the Americans had arrived to stay. And soon, those very roads they built would carry the weapons that would decide the war. By mid-1944, the Pacific Campaign had transformed from scattered island battles into a full-scale offensive, driven by logistics. Nowhere was that transformation more visible than on the twin islands of Saipan and Tinian, where bulldozers, cranes, and human endurance converged to shape the outcome of the entire war. Saipan was the proving ground. The battle began on June 15, 1944. By the time the beaches were secured, the terrain was a ruin of shell holes, twisted metal, and jungle ash. Under normal circumstances, it would have taken months to restore. The Seabees did it in days. The first task, build a functioning supply road from the invasion beaches to the inland ridgelines. Bulldozers cut through volcanic soil still littered with wreckage and the occasional unexploded shell. Combat engineers followed behind, laying crushed coral and planking to stabilize the surface. Within 72 hours, a rough highway linked the front lines to the landing zone. Trucks began streaming forward, hauling ammunition, food, and fuel. The Japanese had never seen anything like it. Their defensive strategy depended on isolating American beachheads, starving them of movement and supply. But as American bulldozers carved paths through the heart of Saipan, that plan collapsed. Japanese tanks bogged down in terrain they once considered impassable. American armor and artillery, delivered along those newly cut routes, broke through with mechanical precision. By late June, with Saipan nearly secured, the Seabees shifted to Tinian. Here, the stakes were even greater. Military planners had chosen the island as the future launch base for America's newest weapon, the Boeing B-29 Superfortress. These bombers needed massive airfields, far larger than any in the region. And they needed them fast. The task bordered on impossible. Tinian was covered in dense brush, coral ridges, and cane fields. There were no natural harbors or roads. Yet, as the first Marine units pushed inland, Seabees followed close behind, driving their machines through burning fields and shattered fortifications. They worked around the clock. Bulldozers flattened ridges that had sheltered Japanese guns. Cranes lifted wreckage out of future runway paths. Graders leveled ground so smooth that bomber wheels could touch down without a tremor. Each day, the island changed shape. Not just captured, but transformed. Within 2 weeks, the first airstrips were operational. In a month, Tinian had 4 massive runways, each capable of handling the heaviest bombers in the world. What began as a patch of jungle had become one of the most important airbases in history. It was here that the B-29s Enola Gay and Boxcar would later take off for their missions to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But in 1944, the transformation of Tinian was more than a feat of construction. It was the physical proof of American inevitability. Japan's generals had hoped terrain and distance would slow the Allied advance. Instead, they watched as those very obstacles were crushed, leveled, and repurposed into the foundation of the next offensive. The jungle no longer defended them. It served their enemy. The bulldozer had become the symbol of a new kind of warfare. One fought not only with firepower, but with the ability to rebuild faster than destruction could occur. And in the Pacific summer of 1944, that power reached its turning point. By the first week of August 1944, the transformation of Tinian was nearly complete. The U.S. flag flew above an island that, only weeks before, had been a labyrinth of Japanese tunnels and artillery caves. Now, under the tropical sun, a new kind of battlefield gleamed, metallic, ordered, and alive with motion. Rows of B-29 superfortresses lined the freshly poured runways, their silver fuselages reflecting the Pacific light. The hum of engines, the roar of bulldozers, and the clang of steel merged into a single rhythm. The sound of American industry made manifest in the middle of the ocean. Japanese reconnaissance planes, flying high and desperate, caught sight of this transformation. Their reports stunned the Imperial General Staff in Tokyo. What they saw from the air defied belief. An island fortress turned into a massive airfield complex capable of launching bombers straight to the Japanese. Homeland.Tokyo's intelligence analysts had estimated that the Americans would need at least 6 months to construct such bases. It had taken them less than 2. That realization sent shockwaves through Japan's war councils. The Pacific no longer seemed endless. It had been bridged by bulldozers. Every stronghold, every defensive line that had once seemed unassailable could now be reached by a combination of steel and soil. Back on Tinian, the Seabees continued to push. Their machines roared day and night, widening roads, reinforcing revetments, and preparing fuel storage depots. Construction battalions 121 and 135 alone moved over 500,000 cubic yards of earth in under 4 weeks. The magnitude was staggering, and it happened under constant threat. Japanese holdouts still launched night raids and sniper attacks, yet even under fire, the work never stopped. Floodlights blazed against the palm trees. Steamrollers groaned over coral rubble. When one machine was hit, another took its place within minutes. It wasn't just engineering. It was momentum, a relentless push forward that seemed to erase the concept of delay. Marines on Tinian later said It felt as if America was building the war's ending right before their eyes. Every road connected to a runway. Every runway pointed west, toward Japan. The line between battle and reconstruction had vanished. The war machine was no longer only destroying, it was creating, reshaping, and preparing for the final act. In Tokyo, the Imperial Army's engineers studied photographs of the new airfields. One noted grimly in his report, "The enemy builds as he fights. His machines are his soldiers." For the first time, Japanese military planners began to acknowledge a truth they had long resisted, that industrial power, not bravery or endurance, would decide the Pacific War. The sight of American bulldozers at work had become a kind of prophecy. Every island lost would be rebuilt into a weapon against the next. By September, Tinian was fully operational. From those coral runways, the first test flights of long-range bombing missions began. Soon, the superfortresses were crossing the Pacific in formation, their shadows sweeping over the same waters that had once been Japan's defensive moat. The bulldozers had done more than shape the ground. They had shortened the distance to Tokyo, and from that moment forward, Japan knew that the Pacific was no longer a barrier. It had become a highway, built by American hands. By the autumn of 1944, the Pacific War had entered a new phase, one not defined by isolated island battles, but by the steady, inevitable reach of American infrastructure. The Seabees bulldozers, cranes, and road graders had turned conquest into permanence. Every island captured became a base. Every base became a launching point for the next offensive. On Saipan, the roads carved through ash and coral were now lined with fuel trucks, artillery convoys, and endless supplies of ammunition. Warehouses rose from concrete foundations where Japanese bunkers had once stood. The island, which had been expected to take months to repair, was operating as a full logistics hub in less than 6 weeks. Tinian, meanwhile, had become the most advanced airbase in the Pacific. From the air, it looked almost like a city. Parallel runways stretching for miles, taxiways connecting to hangars, and barracks laid out in precise military grid lines. Everything had been built from the ground up. Coral crushed into gravel, fuel tanks buried for protection, and thousands of tents housing the men who made it possible. This transformation sent ripples far beyond the Pacific. Allied commanders in Washington and Pearl Harbor began to rethink their entire operational tempo. If America could build entire bases within weeks of capture, it meant campaigns could accelerate. Months compressed into days. Speed became the new weapon, but the greatest impact was psychological. Japanese troops, once trained to defend terrain at all costs, now found that terrain itself no longer mattered. Every ridge, every jungle, every stretch of volcanic rock could be reshaped and used against them. Reports from surviving garrisons described feelings of helplessness, watching American bulldozers move through landscapes that had taken months to fortify, wiping away the defenses with machine precision. On Guam, a Japanese lieutenant later recalled seeing Earth itself turned into an American ally. His men had spent weeks preparing obstacles in the thick vegetation, believing it impassable to vehicles. Within days of the American landing, those same forests had been cut through with straight, coral-paved roads wide enough for Sherman tanks. For U.S. soldiers and Marines, this new infrastructure meant survival. Ambulances could reach the wounded. Supplies could arrive before rations ran out. Entire hospitals were erected beside runways. In some places, Seabees built chapels, movie theaters, and baseball fields, a reminder of the life waiting beyond the war. It was more than morale. It was civilization reclaiming the battlefield. The contrast could not have been sharper. Japanese soldiers, operating on dwindling supplies and strict rations, saw the Americans living with mechanical abundance. Hot meals, fresh water, even ice delivered from portable refrigeration units. The sight of such efficiency shattered any illusions of parity. To many Japanese prisoners, the most shocking discovery wasn't a weapon, but a machine, the bulldozer, a simple piece of equipment that embodied American power. It was the perfect symbol, not just destruction but creation, not chaos but order, not a temporary force but a permanent presence. By late 1944, Allied intelligence intercepts confirmed what commanders already sensed, that Japanese morale was collapsing not only from battlefield losses, but from an unspoken understanding that America's ability to build was limitless. The Pacific was no longer a wilderness of islands. It had become an American network of roads, bases, and runways, a living architecture of war. The lessons of Saipan and Tinian carried directly into the next stage of the Pacific campaign, Iwo Jima and Okinawa. By the time American forces began planning these assaults, the method was refined to near perfection. Seize, secure, construct, advance. It was warfare as engineering, and nowhere else on Earth had it been executed at this scale. At Iwo Jima in February 1945, the Seabees landed just hours after the first wave of Marines. They came ashore under mortar fire, their machines lashed to barges and amphibious pontoons. As the volcanic ash clogged tank treads and filled rifle barrels, bulldozers began clearing runways amid the smoke and chaos. Within days, even before the island was fully secured, American planes were landing on airstrips built atop the ruins of Japanese positions. The airfields on Iwo Jima became emergency landing sites for hundreds of damaged B-29 bombers returning from missions over Japan. Thousands of airmen owed their lives to those bulldozed strips of ground. Once again, American construction had turned destruction into salvation. By April, the campaign moved to Okinawa, the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific. This time, the Japanese defenders had prepared for everything except what followed the landing. As the battle raged, Seabees fanned out across the island, carving an entire transportation grid in real time. In 6 weeks, they built 850 miles of roads, repaired 6 airfields, and constructed massive fuel depots capable of supplying the coming invasion of Japan. Observers from both sides recognized the pattern. Japan could still fight bravely, but it could no longer fight effectively. For every hill they defended, the Americans built 3 roads around it. For every trench destroyed, a new airfield replaced it. The war had become one-sided not through superior numbers, but through the sheer ability to adapt the environment faster than the enemy could react. Even Japanese engineers began to admit it in their technical reports. One captured document found on Okinawa read simply, "Their strength lies not in soldiers or ships, but in the speed with which they rebuild." It was a revelation that reached the highest levels in Tokyo. By the summer of 1945, the Imperial General Staff understood that even if Japan somehow held its remaining islands, it could not stop what was coming. The American war machine would pave, build, and supply its way across the Pacific until it stood at Japan's shores. The final confirmation came from Tinian itself. In early August 1945, the airfields built barely a year before had become the departure point for the most consequential missions in human history. Enola Gay and Boxcar lifted off from those coral runways, carrying the atomic bombs that would end the war. In that sense, the story of American bulldozers and Seabees was more than an engineering triumph. It was the physical manifestation of industrial power turned strategic dominance. What began as muddy roads and makeshift depots had reshaped the world's largest ocean into a highway of victory. For Japan, it was the final confirmation of defeat. For America, it was proof that victory was not only won on battlefields, but built, mile by mile, with steel and willpower. The jungles that once resisted conquest had become roads that led directly to peace and to the dawn of a new world order. When the guns finally fell silent in August 1945, the Pacific was no longer the vast, untamed ocean it had been when the war began. Across thousands of miles, from the black sands of Iwo Jima to the green hills of Okinawa, there now ran a chain of roads, ports, and airfields, a man-made geography of victory. It had been built not by generals or strategists, but by men with grease on their hands and dust in their lungs. Men who measured progress in miles of road and tons of coral. The Seabees had done something more enduring than destroy an enemy. They had proven that construction could be as decisive as combat, that an army which builds faster than it bleeds can reshape the world around it. For the Japanese, the sound of the bulldozer became the sound of inevitability. It meant the Americans had come, and they would not be leaving. The same engines that leveled jungles also laid the foundations of peace, transforming battlefields into bases, and bases into beginnings. Decades later, many of those airfields still exist. Some became civilian airports, others reclaimed by the jungle. But the imprint remains, a testament carved into coral and soil, proof of a moment when engineering and endurance merged to decide history. The Pacific War was a clash of empires, of ideologies, of wills. Yet, in the end, it was also a story of builders, of men who turned ruin into order and chaos into structure. Their machines didn't just move Earth, they moved the future.